Storygram Network.
Hello, I'm Jeff Davis. Thank you for joining me today for another compelling story as I travel on the wine road.
I usually refer to myself as owner and winemaker. I mean, it's fairly extraordinary that 41 years into it, I'm still actively the winemaker.
Are you? I was wondering about that. I've mentioned numerous times and have heard from assistant winemakers that they often do more of the work than the winemaker.
Oh, there's no doubt about that.
On today's podcast, I'm proud to feature another icon in the California wine industry. And as is often the case, you may not recognize his name, but it's very possible you've seen John Williams' brand, Frog's Leap. I've interviewed John's early partners in the brand over the years, Larry Turley of Turley Wine Cellars and Julie Johnson of Tres Sabores, each of whom shared stories of their time with John prior to launching the brand and until they left to start their own personal projects. So I thought it would be interesting to incorporate their tales as well. We have 40-plus years of John's story to tell, so let's get right to it. Shortly after meeting up, John invited me to lunch after our interview, which happens from time to time. So, about an hour and a half later, after the interview, we were heading down to Yountville, north of Napa, and I decided to follow him so I could head back home to Santa Rosa afterward. John said, "I'll come around from the back in my green and white truck." As I was waiting in my car in the tasting room Circle Drive, here comes this 1969 Chevy pickup. It could have been a scene from any movie about the early days of the California wine industry. Here's a guy who's experienced great success, the true details of which will be discussed later in the interview. Yet his vehicle of choice is a '69 Chevy truck. On a side note, not to mislead you, he also owns a Tesla. As I've said before, many of these winemakers and certainly growers are basically farmers. They pick grapes, they make a delicious juice, and sell it, in its simplest terms. But John has business savvy as well as a ripe sense of humor. We sat more than 6 feet apart at the opposite end of his conference table, just off the huge 3-story barrel building, and I started with this statement. Well, first of all, your story on the Frog's Leap website is frickin' hilarious. I have to compliment you on it. It's so fun to read.
Well, what's the old saying, never spoil a good story with facts, and so it has been somewhat edited, as you can see. Of course, they incorporated some of my edit comments on the website, so yeah. It is kind of fun to read through it, and you know, as time goes along, you forget some of these things, and so it's good to have it written down.
In the last paragraph, it stated that time and time, Frog's Leap has had the willingness to change, innovate, improve, and to refine. And, you know, most successful businesses strive to adopt that mission. But the way you pulled it off with clever determination while not taking yourself too seriously is impressive.
Yeah, it's in a way, it's the Frog's Leap paradox, in that I think we are very committed as growers and makers of wine, that we do intend to take our place amongst the wine growing families in the world. We are completely dedicated to quality, like so many vineyards are. We are deeply committed to understanding how to do things better, particularly more ecologically and sustainably. But we have always felt that wine should be a joyful part of life, not just life itself, you know. And so we've always tried to incorporate that's even in our mission statement.
Oh, good, yeah. And, you know, and a good team is the foundation, and experience can be considered the building blocks, and you were able to put those together, and that's what I'd like to talk with you about today.
Well, let's talk about it. Honestly, a winery is not one person. It is a collection of individuals, each with their own contribution, and I have been blessed over the many years to have so many wonderful people bring their own talents and their own interest to the winery. It's spectacular, yeah.
And from the very beginning at Frog's Leap, I mean, I mentioned to you on the phone the other day that just last week I rebroadcast my interview with Larry Turley from some years ago. And during the interview, he told his version of the story of finding someone camping on his property. And it went like this.
I bought this property in 1974. I was up all night in the emergency room. I came home, and there's a tent in my front yard. I've owned it one day. So I drove my motorcycle through the tent.
And you were the guy in the tent.
I was the guy in the tent, yeah.
And he was somewhat startled, a long beard and real long hair, and a big motorcycle.
Did you know he was not in the tent?
I didn't know what was there or what I was going to find out. I said, "What are you doing?" And he, somewhat startled, he pulled a bottle of wine from under his pillow and said, "Well, I was about to have a glass of wine." So I said, "That's not a bad answer."
Yeah, Larry's an amazing character, as you now know well, right?
Yeah.
And it's really the extraordinary generosity of Larry to me and my family in the initial startups of the winery are things of legend. He is really one of the true characters in the wine business, and not a bad doctor, actually, as it turns out.
Yeah. He was a surgeon at the time?
He was an emergency room physician.
Yeah.
But took it very, very seriously.
But the question remains, why were you camping out on Larry Turley's property?
Yes, I had known his sister, Helen, at Cornell, and she had given me the address of Larry's property, and I thought had made arrangements for me to visit with him on a trip out here on spring break from Cornell. And so when I got there at his house, one, the house looked abandoned. It was late in the evening. And two, no one was there. And so I had no other place to go. Apparently arrangements hadn't been quite conveyed as well as I thought.
Uh-huh.
And so I camped, and Larry showed up the next morning. It was a fairly impromptu tent, I think, but fortunately I had a bottle of wine with me, and we enjoyed that for breakfast and a couple others, and that's when we decided to start a winery together.
That's what it's so funny that you guys just share a bottle of wine and all of a sudden you're talking about having a business together.
Well, I think probably more than one winery's been started that way.
Well, that could be. And also Julie Johnson was part of that initial team as well, and she was an integral part eventually too as well. And so the three of you were like a great band, rock stars, and then you each ended up going your own way to pursue solo careers, and all three were very successful.
Well, and look, I can't say that some of those transitions weren't without their own difficulties, but the proof of good intent and good people is that when the separations do occur, as they inevitably do in life, the success of all the parties involved are a good indication that you were fair and thoughtful in the process of getting there. Yes, so when I met Larry, it was mid-70s, 75. And Julie, even though she was a California girl, grew up near Palo Alto, was on the East Coast. So I actually met her when I was the winemaker at Glenora Wine Cellars in the late 70s.
And here's a little more history on that from Julie's perspective.
John and I I'm from California. In fact, I went to summer camp up in Calistoga when some of the streets were still dirt streets. So it was great. And then later on, we moved here in 1980 from the East Coast, where we had both in part gone to school and trained, and I had trained as a nurse and public health nurse. And so when he was given the opportunity to come back here in 1980, I came with him and got hitched. And then not too long after that, we ran into one of his old friends, and both families sold their motorcycles, and we bought our first grapes and started Frog's Leap.
And those three were the nucleus of Frog's Leap Wine Cellars for more than a decade. Before joining Frog's Leap in 1981, John had an incredible opportunity to work with Warren Winiarski just after he founded Stag's Leap Wine Cellars, which presented a monumental opportunity. And was it right, you were the first employee or the only employee with him?
When I started in 75, the spring of 75, no one else was working at the winery except out in the vineyard. Warren was pretty much in control of his own cellar at that point, but he needed help, and we were bottling. He was just about ready to bottle the 73 cab, and so he needed help on the bottling line and some analysis work, and I was about ready to start school at Davis. So yes, I was he credits me generously, I think, as being his first winemaker, but there was no question that he was actually the winemaker, and he just gave me, he probably gave me the title so he didn't have to pay me so much. I'm not sure.
Boy, and that wine went on to beat the French in the Paris tasting of 1976.
Well, and it's funny, I just joked about this because, we're still 46 years later, we're still talking about the Paris tasting, and it's just, it's crazy, really, when you think about how one wine made such an impact in the wine industry, for good or ill, depending on how you look at it. But I was saying that I probably was the most important person in the production of that wine, in that I took the bottles out of the cases and sparged them with nitrogen and put them on the bottling line. And so had I not done that properly, there might not have been a 73 cab from Stag's Leap to win the Paris tasting. So I think I should probably get a little bit more credit than I do.
Sure, yeah. And sadly, Stag's Leap doesn't get mentioned in that movie Bottle Shock. It's all about Chateau Montelena and their Chardonnay. So you guys got totally overlooked with that one. Nonetheless.
I think that was actually Warren's choice. He didn't want to dramatize it in that way, having read the script, and so he declined to be part of the movie.
Yeah, which wasn't terribly factual.
Like we say, never spoil a good story with the facts.
Right. Yeah, you understood, but then you went back to New York, which I found interesting. And did you just want to get your feet wet in a different environment?
Well, there was an amazing group of us at UC Davis. So I was working half my time at Stag's Leap, and half the time I was taking classes over at UC Davis. Both people thought I was full-time with them, so but there was an amazing group of people, everyone from Kathy Corse and Tony Soder, John Consgard, Dick and Dave at Sainsbury. I mean, it was just a plethora of really talented people who were going to come to mark the next generation of winemaking. We graduated, I graduated in 77. This was a graduate school MS degree. And there were several assistant winemaker jobs available here in California, but I was intrigued because there was a head winemaking job available in the Finger Lakes. The New York State had just passed a farm winery law allowing smaller wineries to start. And I had the chance, working at the Taylor Wine Company while I was at Cornell, to see the potential of vinifera. I had befriended a guy named Dr. Constantine Frank.
Oh yeah,
and just a genius, and a really good buddy named Herman Wiemer, and they were convinced of the viability of vinifera and the superiority of Finger Lake Riesling, as was I. And so I saw this as an opportunity to go back and earn my chops as a head winemaker, kind of right out of the deal. Be part of this resurgence of the New York State wine industry, which, if you know much about what's going on there now, it's an absolutely amazing thing. And
sure.
And I was right at the very beginning of that. But having met a California girl back there and missing the Napa Valley, we decided that was only a 3-year stint. So I came back in 80 and took the head winemaking job at Spring Mountain Vineyard. And Larry and I started, and Julie started Frog's Leap the year after that as a part-time.
81, huh? Yeah.
81, yeah.
When did you leave to go back to New York? What year was that?
So I made the wines in Glenora Wine Cellars in the fall of 77.
Okay.
But they had, I started working with them in the summer because they were setting up this winery but didn't know how to order hoses and valves and things, pumps and things so I got to really do a winery from the very beginning, which was a tremendous opportunity. Really.
I wasn't going to bring it up, but since you just mentioned all that new equipment, I read about the explosive event that happened at the crowning.
Yes. I learned the vagaries of three-phase wiring when we rewired the motor improperly, and it shot the grapes up into the air into the assembled masses as opposed to taking them down into the crusher, which was an inauspicious start for this supposedly genius winemaker having come from California. But
It was like a welcoming event, right?
And
the governor was there, was that right?
And the lieutenant governor.
The lieutenant governor.
Yes.
And
we had Leon Adams, we had wine writers. I had advised them that not to do this because we hadn't had a chance to try all the equipment, but they were bound and determined to turn it into a public relations event. And so, lesson learned: test all the equipment before you have a PR event at your winery.
Right. I was also terribly impressed when you moved back to Napa Valley. Your first job was head winemaker at Spring Mountain Vineyard, which was also one of the award-winning wines at the Paris tasting. The Chardonnay was one of the top 5.
Yeah, it was a very prestigious appointment, actually, and I feel lucky to have gotten it, Spring Mountain. So yes, it was, and honestly, I think it was the attention that got drawn to me in New York State because that was the New York Times was all over about these new wineries. So I had a lot of press coverage, and I think when you hire a winemaker, the winemakers have got several jobs. Only one of them is to make wine.
Right, absolutely.
And part of your job is to draw attention to the wines that are in, and to be part of the sales effort as well. The lesson many of us have had to learn the hard way. And so if you're able to attract attention to the winery, you add value to yourself as a winemaker. I think a lot of winemakers have found that there's more value in their PR efforts than there is their winemaking efforts, and I think that can be a little sad, but you have to find that balance when you're a winemaker.
While John was at Spring Mountain Vineyard, he and Larry Turley continued their friendship, which included drunken evenings in a hot tub.
Yeah, there are many drunken moments at the early beginning of Frog's Leap. Larry was a physician and not necessarily a businessman. I came off my family's dairy farm and had no business experience whatsoever. Julie was a public health nurse.
Right.
And so we had to write bylaws when we farmed the company, and I think the first bylaw we decided was that any decision made while sober had to be rethought over a bottle of wine. And then someone made the amendment to that it should be rethought over a bottle of wine in the hot tub, which was the central feature of Frog's Leap at that time in the late 70s and early 80s.
On the frog farm.
Yeah, on the frog farm, yeah. Larry's place had been a commercial frog raising farm, which of course is where we get the Frog of Leap. And then Stag's Leap, where we had gotten our first grapes to make the first 5-gallon jug of wine for the frog farm. We drank way too much of it one night and decided it should be called Frog's Leap. And I think that's the evening that someone came up with the motto for Frog. It was a very creative evening. We came up with the motto, time's fun when you're having flies. Yeah. We were not yet entirely serious about our business endeavor, I guess it would be fair to say.
And I don't think you ever reached that point, did you?
Well, please don't tell my 200 acres of vineyards and 65 employees and $22 million of debt in the bank that I'm not serious now, but yeah.
Wow. So your first release was in 1981?
1981.
And it was Sauvignon Blanc and Zinfandel.
Sauvignon Blanc and Zinfandel, both from the Spotswood Vineyard, which I knew well because of they were a primary supplier of grapes to Spring Mountain before they went out on their own in '82, I think. But Mary had grapes available. Her Sauvignon Blanc was actually fairly in demand, but she had some old vine Zinfandel she couldn't sell, and so when she agreed to sell us the Sauvignon Blanc if we took some Zinfandel grapes as well, and both turned out spectacularly. It's a fantastic vineyard. And but that Zinfandel was taken out to plant Cabernet Sauvignon, which I still consider to be a bad idea. The Cab from Spotswood is very good, of course, but I think the Zinfandel would have been even more spectacular.
Yeah, that was about the period when Zinfandel vineyards were kind of losing their spot here in Napa Valley.
And that continues. Zinfandel is very much an endangered species in the Napa Valley.
Yeah. Well, thankfully, and Larry certainly has made a name for himself as Zinfandel.
You can't discount, and no one should discount the role that Larry has played in keeping these old vineyards in production of Hain Vineyard and others. Yeah. And we've done some of that, but Larry really deserves a lot of credit for that.
And his winemaker, Tegan Pasalacqua, who's
yes,
part of the Historic Vineyard Society and
yeah.
Put a lot of work into saving vineyards across the state.
Across the state, yeah. It's a great story.
But you mentioned that you went to Cabernet and Chardonnay in '82, but then you went back to Zinfandel in '85.
Well, yeah, so Mary took out the Zinfandel vineyard, so we didn't have the source. But then we started to sell the Zinfandel, and people fell in love with it. It was a gorgeous wine, still is. We opened a bottle not too long ago of the 80.
Yeah, that's right, you said that.
And so we said, oh my gosh, so we started looking in the Batuello vineyard, which was very close to the old Frog Farm, had old vine Zinfandel available. So we started looking around and started making Zinfandel again, I believe, in 85, 86.
Yeah. John Williams, the founder, the owner, and head winemaker at Frog's Leap. A week before our interview, I spoke to him on the phone, and he said he was on his way to see Amigo Bob, who's a guy who played a major role in the future of Frog's Leap, starting in the 80s.
Yeah, so Amigo came into our life in 1988. He was really the primary organic farming consultant for the entire state and all crops. And he had helped out Paul Dolan, my friend up at Fetzer Vineyards. And when I asked Paul for some guidance as we decided to explore organic farming in the late 80s, he recommended Amigo Bob, and Amigo came down in spring of 88, and we got a number of our growers together, and that's when we decided to pursue organic farming. It was a real revelation. The seeds for that had been sown much earlier in my own farming interest, but also I think in Larry and Julie's health interests. And so they conspired to make this a pretty easy call for us to be among the first really to explore organic farming, at least in Napa.
I was wondering if you were ahead of the curve on that movement.
Yes, we thought we were significantly ahead. We were the first to certify a vineyard organic in Napa in 1989. But as it turns out, other people, including Spotswood, were interested in it or pursuing it at least. And so we don't take the credit for being first. We can only take credit for being the first to be certified organically grown. But even then, we're talking about 2 or 3 producers who are interested in organic, is at the most. And there wasn't much known about it. There wasn't much known about how to do it. So we actually started an organic farming school in 1990 that now is run by the grape growers and is very popular. And so I think that maybe our biggest contribution wasn't so much that we were first, it was that we took it upon ourselves to spread the word, if you will, and teach others and share experience with others. And now I'm proud to say there are more certified organic vineyards in Napa County than any other county in California. So that's pretty cool.
Great, yeah. And you're pretty much sustainable here as well because of your solar energy and your dry farming.
Yeah, I think, and really I give the understanding of organic farming led to a deeper understanding of, well, yeah, we have healthy soils, but where do our farm workers live? What are our buildings made of? Where does our power come from? What's our watershed like? How do we use water? All those questions become part of a bigger awareness of the issues that affect a sustainable business. And they talk about the 3 E's of sustainability, economic viability, and you can't ignore that because if you're not economically viable, the other 2 E's seem to be the first thing to be sacrificed. Environmental responsibility, which is where we really kind of started with all this. But what we've been focused on probably more so in the last handful of years is the social equity part of this. So making sure that our farm workers, for example, are all full-time employees and have health benefits and livable wages, things that are not as sexy and don't you make it into the news so often, but I think are part of the fundamental values of sustainability that certainly are something we're very interested in.
It's a major component, and I'd like to point out the fact that taking care of your employees is part of sustainable practices.
Yeah, no doubt about it. There's a social equity part to this that makes sense. As it turns out, it's also good business sense, and all these things have really proven to be everyone assumes there's some sacrifice in dry farming, for example, or what did that cost you to be? We have the first LEED certified building in the California wine industry, and everyone assumed that it just cost so much and didn't give anything back, that it was a generosity on our part. But these, we believe, are good business decisions that have paid themselves back many times over.
Sure.
And so I think that's what gets me excited about at least some hope in the conversation of climate change and everything else, is that, in fact, the things that we need to solve these problems are good business decisions anyway, and that it shouldn't be that big of a stretch to make the changes we need for a more sustainable future.
Absolutely. Speaking of economics, as I was reading through how you guys progressed so much in the early years, and then shortly after when you went on your own and buying up vineyards and leasing vineyards, long-term contracts, I was wondering, where did you get your money? Because it didn't seem like you guys had much coming in the early days.
Well, I learned the power of borrowing. It made me my single biggest talent, to be honest with you, is that I very early on realized that there are lots of people who have got a lot of money and haven't got a clue what to do with it. And there's only a handful of us that actually know what to do with that money, and that we actually provide a service if we take their money and invest it wisely and with some rate of return to them, and with the promise that we'll pay it back eventually. So that's the way we've operated, is we use a combination of banks, and actually the Prudential and the Ag Lending Division of Prudential Insurance has been fundamental in our being able to buy and finance vineyards. I will say, and it sounds imprudent to, what's the old story, never a lender or a borrower be, but if you've got a good business concept and you can attract capital, I don't think it's the worst way to go, as opposed to taking on investors and so on and so forth. Because you've got the only thing they want back is their money and their interest.
Yeah, right. And maybe some good wine along the way.
And not only that, they're very skilled at analyzing your business and not lending to you unless they've got a fairly full confidence. So it's also a business check that you've got a solid enough business to be able to take on leverage. So I always felt comfortable that, if they're willing to lend it to me and these guys are the experts, then why not?
Yeah, they have faith in me. I must know what I'm doing.
But it's taken 40 years to get this far in debt, so it's not something you can do overnight, that's for sure.
Are you proud of that?
I'm very proud of that, quite honestly. And, in business, they talk about the debt to equity, the amount you owe as opposed to the amount you supposedly be worth if you had to sell it all. And we've never been in a better position that way. So I guess that's how it has to be measured.
Well, looking around here, it looks like you are definitely a success. I wish I could be successful enough to go $22 million in debt. I can easily succumb to debt, but not at that level. As he explains it further, I think you'll find it impressive how he measures the success of Frog's Leap.
I've always been willing to measure success in a different way. A lot of people measure success by the kind of car they drive, or the number of airplanes they have, or the fanciness of their house, or the artwork that they can buy, or whatever it is. And those have never been our measure of success here. It's always been the amount of pleasure that we take in our day-to-day activities, the success of our employees. We measure it as part of this whole social equity calculation, is the ratio of the lowest compensated employee in your company to the highest compensated employee in your company. We each year measure our success by narrowing that ratio.
Oh, nice.
And so it's a different way of thinking about success, but I think it actually is one that more modern businesses are looking at. And to the extent we're developing these B corporations and so on, beneficial corporations, people who actually continuously measure their success against a set of equitable standards for society, and I think that's pretty cool, and certainly part of what we're.
Well, we were talking earlier about the building blocks, and if you have talented people and you pay them properly to stick around, and gosh, so often in the wine industry you hear about, especially vineyard managers that are with wineries for 30, 40 years because they were taken care of.
Yeah, it should be a very symbiotic relationship, and but I think that there's even more to that. I think that, and we have found this as we have evolved and are thinking about all these sustainability issues, is that your employees get very engaged in that pursuit as well, and they can see they're proud to be part of a company that's taking care of its properties and people and the environment and so on and so forth. So, these are not robots. These are people with real concerns for their own future and their kids' future as well.
Right.
And so they take as much pride in our efforts in sustainability as we do as the
Certainly is respectable.
Yeah.
So backing up a little bit, so in 93, Larry decided to start Turley Wine Cellars, and he was going to stay on the Frog Farm. So you and Julie had to go out and find a spot. And right behind me is the Red Barn that also has 40 acres here in Rutherford, and certainly a wonderful place to be in Napa Valley.
Well, we were extremely fortunate because, Frog's Leap, it was a difficult time, I'll be honest with you, the early 90s, because it was that stretch where we didn't have a lot of money. There was things were tight. Larry was getting more and more interested in being in the wine. Things had to come to a head, and honestly, I think ultimately the decision was made in the hot tub is that we needed a second winery, and so we created Turley and equalized its value, and then we did a corporate split. So Larry got to keep Turley and half the assets of the company, and we got to keep the name Frog's Leap, but needed a new winery. And we were very fortunate to find this beautiful old red barn, nearly collapsed at that point, but with a great history of its own, having been built as a winery in 1884. It didn't look like it did now. It was in very bad condition, and the vineyards were dead to phylloxera. And this beautiful garden that you see out here was actually a toxic waste dump at that point. So it's had a little progress since that point.
That's where they say you got it for a song, huh?
Yeah. Yes, a song we didn't have enough time to sing, but it was worked out, and it largely. And boy, I think about all the wonderful and generous people in my life, and Lori Wood and Chuck Carpy of Freemark Abbey certainly came to the table with a lot of generosity, and it made this happen. And I think they were glad to see the property come into hands of someone who was willing to take it on and restore it. And
sure. Well, wise decision on their part, looking back.
Yeah, looking back. Yeah.
And then by 96, you started purchasing more vineyards or leasing, and then started releasing a larger number of varietals.
We added Merlot in 1990, and then we've always been interested in some of the heritage varieties. So we've got a nice planting of Charbonneau and Mourvedre, and we have a little Riesling and some Carignan, and we keep a little Napa Gamay. We make a wine out of that we call Heritage Blend. Some of these were when we bought the Rossi Ranch in 2007. I'm skipping ahead. Had some of these heritage vineyards on it, and so we kept those. So yes, it has been a slow accumulation. We're actually decided almost 20 years ago not to make more wine. So we're at the same size we were 20 years ago.
Oh, great.
But at that point, we were buying most of our grapes. And so the decision was to not make more wine, but to invest in growing our vineyards and our buildings. So this beautiful barrel building here was built in 99. So we invested more in our becoming what I guess you would call a real winery, as opposed to essentially a marketing company before then, where we were buying our grapes, making our wine, and but didn't have our own vineyards. And so that's actually our track now. In fact, there's some discussion of even getting smaller now and concentrating.
It's funny how you see that happening these days. I've noticed that at a few places. It's a smart move. If you've reached a certain pinnacle, there's no need to keep growing, and it might even be beneficial to back off a little bit. And that's what actually was Clos d'Aval who did that not too long ago.
Yeah, I think it does cut down on your ability to buy private jets and so on. But again, that's not part of the way we measure success. So, really, we will measure success by taking our position next to the other great wine growing families of the world. And but that takes time, that takes generations. You don't achieve that overnight. Yeah.
What production size are you at these days?
So we farm about 80 hectare, or about 200 acres of grapes, which in a good year will give us somewhere between 800 and 1,000 tons of grapes. We got a little bit less than that this year. And as you know, if you do the math, that makes somewhere between 45 and 55,000 cases of wine. So that's the size we've been for a long time. Half of that white wine, Sauvignon Blanc and Chardonnay, and half reds and Merlot and Cab.
That's not huge. I mean, it's not massive. Anything below 100,000 it's big, but it's not larger.
I think a lot of people think Frog's Leap is bigger than it is.
Well, you're widely distributed, though, aren't you?
We have got a very strong presence in restaurants all over the country, and I think that is a very visible presence. To be, it turned out to be a little bit of a difficulty this year when virtually the restaurant industry closed down across the world. So that's been a bit of a transition and been a difficult time for us. But we'll be back for our restaurants when they're ready to be back online. But we've had enormous success selling the bulk of our wine in restaurants, and that has a high presence, and I think people see it. Like, we're very fortunate to have a lot of support from our restaurants here in Napa and Sonoma, and so you see it a lot, and people say, well, they must make a lot of it.
Right. Well, and you're some grocery stores too, aren't you, and liquor stores?
Yeah, we will sell to anyone, basically, but usually you're in the very big purchasing operations like a Costco or someone like that. It's not that we have anything against Costco. It's just that to do a deal with them requires a deal, basically.
And
a
sacrifice.
It's just, and often a sacrifice.
Well, it's important if you're a newer label and trying to get brand awareness, but if you don't need that, it's not really that necessary.
Yeah, and so we always focused on restaurants.
Yeah, great. Yeah, well, I thought you were much larger than 50,000 cases.
No, actually, we're smaller than Turley.
Oh, really? Yeah.
One of the great ironies of this whole thing, I think, Larry wanted to stop and do something smaller and more on his own property, and now he's bigger than we are.
That's funny.
Very successful.
Well, and he sources from so many vineyards across the state. It's crazy.
Yeah.
So you gotta bottle it and sell it.
Well, and Larry likes to fly his little airplane, and so I think having an operation down in Paso Robles gives him a chance to fly down there and then to fly up the Sierra. So it fits into his lifestyle rather nicely.
So he does have that trapping of success, doesn't he?
Well, I don't know that he has got a Learjet or anything like that.
So it was about 2005 when your construction began here on the hospitality center, the Vineyard House, and.
Yes, we focused on the restoring the Red Barn, and then we focused on building a proper barrel building, which we built in '99. But then all the money seemed to be going into vineyard and vineyard development, and we were still operating the winery out of a double-wide trailer up until 2005. Oh. And it was getting a little ridiculous, and also the visitation part of the business, where people would come and visit the winery, and we started the Fellowship of the Frog, our version of a wine club,
right?
And people wanted to come here, and they didn't necessarily want to see a double wide trailer, so we made in 2005 the investment in the Vineyard House, which. And we mentioned it earlier, but it was the first LEED certified building in the California wine industry, and it's got a very cool story behind all the things that we did to get the LEED certification using geothermal and recycled materials and so on. It was a great and wonderful learning experience, and we're very proud of that, actually.
I saw behind glass in there that you picked up the Huge Pear Award. I'm not sure if that's what it's called, but that for sustainability.
Oh yes, that's probably my proudest moment. The Ecological Farming Association holds an annual conference down in Asilomar called the Ecological Farming Conference, and this is basically all the hippie farmers from all over the world come to this thing. It's a real big deal, and it's 4 or 5 days of sharing information and seed and farming methods and talking about farm planning and so on and so forth. In the hippie farming community, it's kind of our Oscar ceremony, and I was
Nice.
Very, very pleased to have won that a few years ago. I'd be one of the 3 people to win a Susty, it's called.
The Susty.
And it's one of my prouder moments, to be honest with you.
Nice. Well, congratulations. So, gosh, it's been about 40 years. What's your official title now here at the winery?
Well, I usually refer to myself as owner and winemaker. I mean, it's fairly extraordinary that 41 years into it, I'm still actively the winemaker.
Are you? I was wondering about that.
But, I've gotten a crew now who's been with me for so long that there aren't... I can go days without really checking in with Pablo, who we just elevated from cellar master to winemaker.
He's been here a long time.
He's been here a long time. Actually, Paula was with me for 25 years as an enologist, and she just retired to help run her family's coffee business. But we elevated Pablo's daughter to be an assistant winemaker. We've also brought on Jairo. And Rory, who has been running that's my son, my oldest son, who's been running all of our vineyard operations, but is a very skilled winemaker as well, has his own brand, has really taken a lot of the winemaking reins as well. So, we're pretty tight in the cellar. I still feel like I like to know what's going on out there, and not many decisions get made without me knowing what's going on.
Yeah. Well, there's 2 things there you're touching upon. One is I've mentioned numerous times and have heard from assistant winemakers that we know they often do more of the work than the winemaker.
Oh, there's no doubt about that.
And then a lot of guys like you who end up in corporate positions and running a facility like this, you kind of lose touch with being out in the vineyard. You long for that, getting back out there and getting your hands dirty again.
Yeah, it takes a lot of work to keep that balance, quite honestly, because when we mentioned the selling part, that becomes a big part of your job as a proprietor. I am extremely fortunate talking about great employees. 2003, Jonah Beard joined me. Jonah is probably the best wine representative in the industry today, and recognized as so. He can tell the Frog's Leap story better than I can. He believes in it. He is deeply invested in our brand, and he is a great communicator and educator. And so I rely on him very heavily to do a lot of the road work that is required, and that allows me to keep my focus more here at home. And the other thing is you need good CFOs. You need people who know how to run hospitality. Otherwise, you find out that you're spending all your time putting out fires, and that's not time you're tasting barrels or checking out pruning. Right.
Since you mentioned Rory, we do need to give credit to you and Julie. And you separated in 1999, but you have 3 kids together. And again, she's often having a good success with Tres Sabores, beautiful property. And I think was Frog's Leap sourcing from that vineyard she's on now?
Yeah, so Julie and I somehow managed to buy that vineyard in 87, and it had a beautiful old heritage Zinfandel vineyard on it that we used for Frog's Leap. But when Julie and I went our separate ways in 99, as you mentioned, it was her desire at that point. She, like Larry, had come up through the healthcare industry, but had fallen in love with wine right along with the side of us, and in the active part of not only making the wine, but growing the grapes and doing all the marketing and sales. And although Tres Sabores is smaller, she gets to do it all, and I think so she kept what's now Tres Sabores, that vineyard up there, and has done an enormously good job with that. And yes, we've managed to keep a good family relationship going.
And tell me about your other 2 kids other than Rory.
So Kyler, my middle son, actually graduated from Johns Hopkins and worked for many years for Doctors Without Borders, probably back into the healthcare thing a little bit. Yeah. But he was always off in the worst places, dealing with Ebola and everything else. He eventually got a little tired of that, and he came back, and he was the supply chain logistician for Tesla Motor Corporation in the development of the Model 3. And he got tired of that, and now he works for Lagunitas Brewing and is
What a progression.
Yeah, so we figure he's getting back to alcoholic beverage, so there might be room for him at some point here. And then Kelly went to law school and worked for many years for the ACLU, and she got tapped by Governor Brown when he was doing, in the last couple of years of his administration, to help him directly. They worked side by side in analyzing cases where people who had been wrongly convicted or who had been put in jail without parole and so on. And she worked with him to identify a number of those cases. At the end of his administration, he appointed her as a commissioner of the Workmen's Compensation Board, so she is an appeals court judge for workmen's compensation now.
Wow.
So.
You must be proud.
All of them work remotely now, though. I mean,
right.
It's amazing. Yeah, so good kids. And then my stepson Owen, I got remarried in 2010, and with that, Owen came along at 3 years old, and he actually worked the harvest for us this fall because he's on furlough from college. He decided to take the year off. So yeah, keeping it all in the family.
Great, excellent. Well, congratulations on an incredible career and life that you have cut out for yourself here.
Well, thank you, Jeff. It is, it's the years add up, don't? The 41 years seems like a long time, but we're not dead yet. It's funny, to me. My colleagues growing up were the Jack Davies and Warren and John Schaefer and Dan Duckhorn, and I were just best of buddies. And they've all either moved on one way or the other. And so I feel like I'm part of that generation in a way, and yet here I'm was younger, and so now I'm getting to be an elder myself, I guess. And so they're kind of funny times, but we keep things lively around here, and a lot to keep yourself busy. And I think I got a lot of years still to give to the wine business.
Great. Well, some live well into their 80s and 90s in this business, but it's got to be a little scary when people below you start retiring.
Yeah. Yeah. That they have enough money to retire is always amazing to me.
Hey, thanks for your time. I'm glad we finally got to hook up.
I am as well, Jeff. Thanks. Great questions and fun to talk to you.
I mentioned it was finally good to hook up with them because we did talk about getting together once when we were face-to-face, but that was at the Wine and Spirit magazine's Top 100 event in San Francisco, the day after the 2017 wildfires started. So here we are 3 years later, finally making it happen. Check out the written history of Frog's Leap, edited with John's very funny notations, at frogsleap.com. John is yet another of the very cool, down-to-earth people in the wine industry. I really enjoyed my time with him. For more interviews, check out my website, onthewineroad.com, find my show page on Facebook, and please subscribe to my podcast on your favorite platform as On the Wine Road Podcast. And you can find me on Instagram at JD Wine Road. Do your best to stay healthy and happy, and I'll catch you next time around, here on the Wine Road. I'm Jeff Davis.
Hosting for this podcast is generously provided by Transistor at transistor.fm.